I'd like to welcome you to Middle East Discussion Group of the Canada International Council. Before we get started, just a couple of things I want to say. This is a bilingual meeting. On peut parler en français. On peut demander nos questions en français. So please feel free in the chat when we start going with questions. We will do question and answer in both official languages if people should want to do that. Before we get started, though, I would like to just do a short land acknowledgement. And it's one that's personal to me because it's something I didn't know. I've lived in Ottawa for some 20 years now, and I didn't know that the word Ottawa is an Algonquin word, and it's the meaning it means to trade. So I never knew that it was an Indigenous word. I think I knew a very long time ago, but part of my land acknowledgement is to recognize that we are in a place where the Algonquin people once were, and I think it's interesting, given that today we're talking about the Israel-Palestinian situation. So I think it's very appropriate. But with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Koplow. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Capitale. We know your very illustrious background on this, and we very much. I'm not going to read your biography because it speaks for itself. But what I would like to do is turn it over to you for some introductory remarks, and take your time with it. But I think, given your background on this, I very much, and I think the people here in Ottawa would very much like to hear your views on the domestic scene in Israel. I mean, when we watch, the Israeli, the media of Israel here in Western media, there's always a particular a slant, and it's just like we focus on it and then we go away. Oh, it's the most right-wing government. Yeah, but what does it actually mean? What are the implications for democracy? Are the concerns justified in terms of the kind of things that we've been hearing about? So I think our listeners should be very interested in that. I have a lot of questions for you. I know I gave you a hard time last time you were in town, but that's what I do. I enjoy that, and I think that's why we've chosen this business. So without further ado, I turn it over to you to maybe give us some preliminary thoughts on the current government. Maybe also end off on where might be going. I mean, saying that there's escalating violence is one thing, but I think there are some new dynamics happening in Israel, particularly with the youth and how they're turning their support more rightwards and the empowerment of the settlers. So I think it's a very interesting development in Israel that we have not seen as much or maybe not noticed as much. So with that, I turn it over to you, good sir. For our audience, I would ask you that you can please start your questions at any time. I have a little Q&A thing. If you want to start asking questions, I can read them as Dr. Koplow is speaking, and then I can compile them and maybe we can ask some aggregate questions. Dr. Koplow, over to you, and thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Atala, and thanks to the CIC for hosting me. It was great to be in Ottawa in person a few years ago, but this is good too. So the Israeli election and the government and what it means and what may be coming. So I'll do my best to see how much I can squeeze in here in 20 to 25 minutes before we get to people's questions. The new Israeli government, headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, in some ways looks familiar to a lot of observers, primarily because Prime Minister Netanyahu himself is the longest-serving Israeli prime minister in history, and so we are used to seeing him in the prime minister's seat, and we're also used to seeing him in the prime minister's seat with some right-wing parties in his coalition. All that being said, this is, in my opinion, a different type of government than we have seen in Israeli history. I think the makeup of the government is different for a number of reasons that I'll go into. And some of the policies we're already seeing, and I think some of the policies that we can expect to see are also different. And these all do raise questions about where Israel and Israel's democracy are heading on a number of fronts. So to start with, in the past, Prime Minister Netanyahu created coalitions that were anchored by his Likud party, which is the tentpole right-wing party in Israel, but he generally constructed coalitions that were right-leaning but not uniformly right. And so in the past, you had coalitions that he created that had Labor, which is the former tentpole party in Israel on the left, as part of his coalition. He had coalitions with Kadima, which for a time, Kadima was the largest centrist party in Israel. He had ministers from the left, right, and center. And while his governments were certainly right of center governments, there were always some more moderate elements. This time around, that is not the case. We have a coalition of 64 seats. That's out of 120 seats in the Knesset. And 32 of those seats belong to Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party. The other 32 seats belong to 4 other parties, 2 of which are ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and UTJ, and 2 of which are very far-right, ultra-nationalist, right-wing parties. One is religious Zionism, Tzionut HaDatit in Hebrew, led by Bezalel Smotrich, and the other is Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir. Now, the fact that you have a coalition of these 5 parties with Likud actually in many ways being the most left-wing party in this coalition. The ultra-Orthodox parties are a bit hard to characterize, but I think it's safe to say that Likud is the most left-wing and liberal party in this coalition, certainly, and the only one of these 5 parties that is not a religious party explicitly, makes this coalition different. Another way in which this coalition is different is that Prime Minister Netanyahu's power relative to the other parties is far lower than it has been in the past. As I said before, this is a coalition of 64 seats. Only 32 of them belong to Likud. So only half, exactly half, 50% of the seats in this government are controlled by Netanyahu himself. And so he is beholden to his coalition partners in a real way, given that he only controls half the seats. And on top of that, we have this ongoing issue of Prime Minister Netanyahu's criminal indictments. He is still in the midst, it's been going on now for well over a year. He's still in the midst of these 3 criminal cases that he's being tried for. And I think it's safe to say that his motivating factor across the last couple of years has been to make these cases go away. And there are different ways in which this might happen. And I'll talk about some of them in a minute because they tie into some of the concerns about Israeli democracy and judicial reforms. But in order to make these cases go away, he needs the support of his coalition partners. And his coalition partners are willing to make these cases go away, but only in return for their own policy priorities being fulfilled. And in this case, their policy priorities are, in some cases, such as with the ultra-Orthodox, about issues of religion and state, and also about subsidies. And in the cases of religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power, they are really about far more hawkish policies with regard to the West Bank, with regard to Palestinians, with regard to Israeli Arab citizens of Israel, all sorts of things that we're used to seeing from right-wing parties across the globe, but are manifesting themselves, I think, in a uniquely Israeli way. So, with that as the background, what are some of the things that we are seeing? So, the first thing that we are seeing is this category that gets subsumed under judicial reform, and it encompasses a number of things. So, what's important to understand at the outset is that Israel does not have a constitution. What it has are a set of what are called basic laws that were passed by the Knesset over years. The most recent one was passed in 2018. And these basic laws function as a quasi-constitution, but in reality, they don't have any more strength or authority than regular laws do. There's no supermajority required to pass them. They pass with a majority of the voting members of the Knesset. And by that, I don't mean a majority of 61 members of Knesset. I mean a majority of however many Knesset members happen to be in the plenum when they get voted on. And so there's always been this question about how they should be treated. And because there's no constitution, there's also always been a question about whether Israel's Supreme Court has oversight of the government and whether it can strike down legislation. This is a power the Supreme Court effectively acquired for itself in the 1990s And once it did that, because there's no constitution setting forth the balance between the legislature and the judiciary, there has been a critique on the Israeli right that the Supreme Court is effectively this non-democratic body, since it is not elected. And not only is it not elected, it's also not appointed entirely by politicians. There's this idea that you have this non-democratic body that is striking down laws made by the Knesset, which is the democratic body that is elected to and accountable by the people. And in addition, because the Supreme Court has generally been viewed by the Israeli right as a left-leaning institution, that has sort of added fuel to the fire. And so you take these long-standing complaints about the Israeli Supreme Court and these complaints on the right that it's too far left, and you add that to the fact that there is this notion out there stemming from Netanyahu's indictments that there is some sort of judicial deep state that is out to persecute Netanyahu and that is out to get right-wing politicians. And it creates this toxic brew where you now have this movement for what's known as judicial reform. And what judicial reform means in the Israeli context right now, in the form of the bill that's been introduced, or I should say hasn't been formally introduced yet, but proposed by Justice Minister Yariv Levin, is to first make it so that Supreme Court appointments are controlled, not as they are now, where you have a 9-person body that is comprised of a mix of city Supreme Court justices, representatives of the Israeli Bar Association, representatives of the government, and representatives of the opposition. This would change it to a body of 11 members, 7 of whom would be directly controlled by the government. So you'd effectively move to a system where the government has the power to nominate and confirm, because this is a parliamentary system, nominate and confirm Supreme Court justices. Second, it would mean limiting the types of issues over which the Supreme Court can strike down Knesset legislation. Third, it would mean creating a rule whereby the Knesset, with a vote of 61 members of Knesset, so that's just the smallest majority you can have, 61 out of 120, would be able to override a Supreme Court decision striking down legislation. And furthermore, the Supreme Court, if it were to strike down legislation, could only do it with a unanimous panel of 15 judges who all rule unanimously. So this is very different from what we have now. Now, there are lots of arguments that the power has shifted way too much to the judiciary, given that at the moment, if the Supreme Court does strike down legislation, there is no way to override it. But this is seen by many as a massive overcorrection, whereby you effectively remove any power of the Supreme Court to effectively oversee legislation. And this idea of a Supreme Court override bill is necessary to put a lot of things in motion, starting with Prime Minister Netanyahu's court cases. Because if you do one of the things that is being contemplated to get rid of these cases, either firing the Attorney General, something the Supreme Court would almost certainly strike down, or removing fraud and breach of trust as crimes under the Israeli system, which the Supreme Court would almost certainly strike down, or even passing what's known as the French law, which would make it illegal to investigate or indict a sitting prime minister. All of these will go before the Supreme Court. And so the idea is, if you're going to do these things, you first have to pass a Supreme Court override, effectively take away the Supreme Court's power to oversee some of this legislation that might pass. And then you go ahead and you pass this legislation and Netanyahu's court cases go away. So that's one aspect of this. And this has worried many Israelis. What we've seen over the past few weeks is growing demonstrations on Saturday nights in Israel, where the first week there were 80,000 people, the next week there were 130,000 people. This past Saturday night, the demonstrations were smaller, largely resulting from the fact that there was a terrorist attack outside of a synagogue, killing 7 Israelis coming out of Shabbat prayers on Friday night. So that understandably dampened things. But I expect these protests are going to continue and probably grow. We've also had other things. There was a brief 2-hour strike on the part of Israeli high-tech workers last week. There have been many public warnings from judicial figures and from financial figures. The current governor of the Bank of Israel, former governors of the Bank of Israel, warning that this will also destroy the Israeli economy, destroy Israel's credit rating. So we're seeing civil society protests on these issues, and it's seen as really one of the biggest threats within Israeli society, one of the biggest threats to Israeli democracy since the advent of the state. Now, the other big issue that comes up in this question of Israeli democracy with regard to this new government are some of their proposals with regard to the West Bank and some of their proposals with regard to Palestinians writ large, both Palestinians who live in Israel and are citizens, Palestinians who live in Jerusalem as residents of Jerusalem but not as citizens of Israel, and Palestinians living in the West Bank, who of course are neither residents nor citizens of Israel. This new government has all sorts of proposals with regard to West Bank territory. One of the things that they have been talking about doing and pushing pretty hard is retroactively legalizing illegal outposts in the West Bank. And when I say illegal outposts, I mean illegal under Israeli law. There are 132 recognized settlements that are legal under Israeli law in the West Bank. And then there are about another, exact numbers are difficult to come by, but about 210 illegal Israeli outposts and farms in the West Bank. The ones that are legal under Israeli law are legal because they are built on state land rather than private Palestinian land, and they've gone through a permitting and approval process. The illegal outposts have all not gone through any approval or permitting process. They're wildcat outposts that have just been constructed, but many of them are also built on private Palestinian land, something that the Supreme Court in Israel has said is illegal. And in the past, when we've seen evacuations of Israeli settlements or neighborhoods of Israeli settlements, they're generally because they've been built on private Palestinian land, and the Supreme Court has ordered them to be evacuated and destroyed. Once you do something like retroactively legalizing illegal outposts, what you are effectively doing is getting rid of this Supreme Court rule that you can't build on private Palestinian land, because many of these outposts that will be legalized are indeed built on private Palestinian land. And so that in itself is seen as a real problem with regard to democracy and rule of law in Israel. Second, the new Israeli government has talked about doing things like applying sovereignty to the West Bank, but only to the Israeli citizens who live there, or formally annexing the territory, but not granting the Palestinians on the annexed territory citizenship. This, of course, again, raises real questions about what that will mean for Israeli democracy. Certainly within Israel, and I think generally within the international community, there has been this sense that the military occupation of the West Bank does not make Israel non-democratic, because it has been seen as a temporary military occupation over disputed territory that will be settled eventually through any negotiation. Once you start to annex that territory, you are effectively saying that this is not a temporary military occupation, and you've annexed territory and brought it under your control formally. And again, if you're doing that without granting the people living on the territory citizenship, that raises a whole new set of questions about Israeli democracy and what it means for Israel going forward. In addition, there are all sorts of questions about policies that will be taken inside of Israel proper itself. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the head of Otzma Yehudit, the Jewish Power Party, he is the new national security minister, which means that he has control over all sorts of things, including the police. One of the things that he has talked about doing is loosening the rules of engagement. Right now, the rules of engagement for both the IDF and the police are that lethal force cannot be used unless there is an imminent danger to a soldier or policeman's life. Itamar Ben-Gvir wants to change the rules of engagement. So, for instance, if you see a Palestinian teenager approaching a checkpoint holding a pair of scissors, you would, under the new rules of engagement that have been proposed, be allowed to use lethal force on that Palestinian. We've seen, certainly in the United States, I'm aware I'm talking to a Canadian audience, but certainly in the United States, we've seen all sorts of issues over the past few years with this sort of thing, police rules of engagement. And so, it raises, again, questions about rule of law and about discrimination inside of Israel. So that's something that is on the table. And there's also, in the wake of the terrorist attack in Jerusalem last week, where 7 people were killed, there have been a set of policies proposed at the cabinet meeting over the weekend that are going to be voted on, I assume, over the next couple of weeks in the Knesset, proposals about stripping citizenship of Israeli citizens or stripping residency of Palestinian residents of Jerusalem if they are involved in terrorist attacks. And also lots of talk about stripping citizenship or economic benefits of the families of people who carry out terrorist attacks as well. And again, this raises issues of democracy, due process, rule of law, sort of what the mechanisms for this will be. So there are all sorts of, and I could talk about a bunch more, but I do want to make sure we get to questions. This of course raises all sorts of questions about the direction in which Israel is heading. One thing we have not seen yet are the type of challenges to democracy that we've seen, for instance, in the United States around questioning election results. But that's something that actually was percolating a bit during the election campaign. So it's not sort of you don't see the same types of concerns that we've seen, unfortunately, in the United States, or certainly in places like Turkey, where the vote itself is under question, and there are questions about whether the vote will be respected. It's much more about what happens once you have a government that's been elected. What are the limits of what that government can democratically do? What kind of oversight mechanisms can there be, and what will the government carry out that challenge things like rule of law, challenge things like human rights, and challenge things like the role of the judiciary to properly oversee the legislature. So those are some of the things that are on the table at the moment, given the new government and given Israeli policies. And so I'm happy to with that answer any questions.
Great, thanks a lot, Michael. I think it's a great start in terms of laying the groundwork for where we're at. And I'm going to use my privileges as moderator to ask you some of my selfish questions that I have for myself. I was very interested in the override law and the sort of legislative overreach that you described very clearly. I think one of the things that concerns a lot of people in the international community is, is this idea of, not only what the judicial changes are going to mean for Netanyahu, but what does it mean for the West Bank and for Palestinians? So you sort of alluded to it, but I guess I want to dig down a little deeper. Is, maybe Ben Gvir and Smotrich will not push Netanyahu to make these radical changes. Rather, what you're describing sounds like it's going to be these small steps. It's going to be sort of gradual, nothing to scare the world or, the international community, but these small moves. And I'm wondering if you have any more details on where we're at in terms of actually extending Israeli law to those settlements, because isn't that actually a form of annexation without actually annexing anything? It's a sort of you're doing it, but you're not actually declaring it. So it's no longer the Israeli military administration. It just falls under Israeli civilian law. So where are we at in that process, and what does that actually mean for annexation?
The backdrop to this is the debate that happened in Israel in 2019 and 2020 over annexation, where in the course of this, we had these 5 elections over 3.5 years. 2019 was the first of these, and in the course of that campaign, for the first time, Prime Minister Netanyahu promised to annex a specific territory. He promised that he was going to annex the Jordan Valley, and that spurred lots of concern among the left and center in Israel, and certainly among the international community. And then on top of that, you had the Trump Peace to Prosperity plan, which envisioned Israel annexing 30% of the West Bank on day one, and then having I think it was a 2-year period, if memory serves me correctly, a 2-year period where they would negotiate with the Palestinians over the remaining 70% of the West Bank to create a Palestinian state. And then if that was unsuccessful, then at that point, Israel would presumably have free reign to annex more of the West Bank if it wanted. And so this really put annexation in the forefront, and it was very much an in-your-face annexation, right? This notion that you're either going to sort of take the Jordan Valley right away, or you're going to annex 30% of the West Bank right away. And this really, more than anything else, I think, led to the normalization agreement with the UAE and then the Abraham Accords, because the UAE very publicly put this notion on the table that You can have normalization with the UAE, or you can have annexation, but you can't have both. And so, it went away temporarily. Now, Smotrich in particular, who's a very smart and savvy politician, but I think the Israeli right more generally, they learned from this episode that you can't kind of jump to the end. That if they were going to be successful, they were going to have to do it in smaller steps. And so what they have done now at the outset is not to say, hey, we're going to jump forward and annex territory right away. They haven't even yet talked about applying sovereignty to Israeli settlements in the West Bank. They've started with a few small administrative moves, understanding that those are harder for people to understand outside of Israel. They're harder to combat because they're painted as really just administrative changes. And then over time, you sort of move forward. So some of the things that they've talked about doing, and these are encapsulated in the coalition agreements between Likud and religious Zionism. So the first is taking the legal department within the IDF that oversees IDF activities and settlement activities in the West Bank, and moving it out of the military and into the defense ministry. Now, to some people, that may not sound like a big deal, but it actually is a big deal because the defense ministry is still a civilian ministry. The IDF, of course, is a military. And so once you are taking the legal authority over actions in the West Bank out of the military and putting it into the defense ministry, you are starting this process of extending civilian rule to the West Bank, extending sovereignty, and extending what looks like some form of annexation. That's number one. Number two, there is this new strange arrangement in the defense ministry where there is a defense minister, Yoav Gallant, and then there is a minister in the defense ministry, Bezalel Smotrich, who's also the finance minister. And in this coalition agreement between Likud and religious Zionism, Bezalel Smotrich as a minister in the defense ministry, and it was important that he be called that as opposed to being a deputy minister, because as a deputy minister, he'd be directly subordinate to the defense minister. As a minister in the defense ministry, he was given authority over what are called civil issues in the West Bank, meaning authority over construction for both Israelis and Palestinians, and also authority over enforcement of illegal construction for both Israelis and Palestinians. There are two bodies within the IDF that oversee these things. One is COGAT, the Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories. The other is the Civil Administration. COGAT effectively liaises between the IDF and the Palestinian Authority, and the Civil Administration sort of carries out the administration of settlements and of Palestinian residents in Area C. And so Smotrich, under the coalition agreement, has a role in appointing the heads of COGAT in the civil administration. And he also is the person who controls the Supreme Planning Committee, which is the committee that meets to approve construction in the West Bank. Now, moving that under Smotrich's authority and taking it out of the defense minister's authority, again, is this move toward civilianizing Israel's authority in the West Bank. And one of the things that Smotrich has been very open about is that part of what he wants to do here is, once he has control over the civil administration, to start to have things that need to be approved, such as road construction, start with the transportation ministry and not go through the civil administration. And so, again, this is another way of just extending civilian control over the West Bank. And these are portrayed as small administrative things, but in reality, they're big deals. And once you have this, and once you've normalized this notion that if you are an Israeli living in a settlement beyond the Green Line, to do things, you no longer have to go through the military. You now go through the same civilian planning process that any Israeli would living in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Haifa. You've started this process, and the next steps will certainly be then officially applying sovereignty to settlements and possibly annexation of the territory itself. And I should also mention in this push to retroactively legalize illegal outposts, one of the things there is to also, they talk about providing roads and electricity and water to illegal outposts. Most of them actually have it. This is a misnomer. What they're really talking about is allowing the state to pay for them. The way they get paid for now is generally by the regional councils who get money from the state and then pay for it themselves. This would just have the state itself paying to provide roads and electricity and water. And that, again, given that these are illegal outposts, would be yet another big step toward normalizing them, but also toward civilianizing Israel's presence in the West Bank. So, all of these are meant. This is meant to be a smarter way of doing this by doing it kind of piecemeal and making it look as if it's administrative changes at first.
I mean, I think that's a good. It's a good answer, but I mean, a lot of questions coming in here in the chat. I mean, is this moving Israel more towards, and there's questions about it in our chat group, does this move Israel more into a more precarious state in its democracy? And actually in doing this, I mean, how legitimate are those fears? There's a question on, how are diaspora Jews, particularly in the United States, reacting to this? Because, many people say, well, this is not the Israel that I know, or it's not the Israel that, we signed up for. I mean, it's certainly when, one comment is about sort of, does this move Israel closer to being in an apartheid situation, particularly given the demographic reality that are changing, and given that Israel controls all the laws that are being applied. So I'm curious how you would answer that question. I know I threw a lot at you, but it's a combination of a bunch of questions that are coming in along the same themes.
Yeah, very, very, all good and important questions. So on the question of democracy, when I was a political science PhD student, there was this debate about, and I'm probably still going on, a debate about democracy, right? Is democracy like pregnancy? Either you're a democracy or you're not, or is it along a continuum? And much of the literature around democracy and authoritarianism over the past couple of decades has really started to look at it much more as a continuum, right? We have these different categories of liberal democracy, electoral democracy, illiberal democracy, hybrid regimes, all sorts of things. So I'm not sure, that the things that are taking place now are going to sort of flip a switch, right? Where, today we'll say Israel is democratic and tomorrow we will say, no, it's not. But there's no question that many of these measures are moving Israel away from the more democratic side of things toward a more precarious position. And at the end of this, will it still be possible to call Israel an electoral democracy? I think probably, although again, that depends on many things, right? If Israel does indeed annex the West Bank with its 2.8 million Palestinians and only grants citizenship to a handful of them or, to none of them, that certainly will raise questions about Israel as an electoral democracy. But, I think many of these moves certainly are moving Israel, as I said, toward a more precarious spot on this democratic spectrum. And the issues in the West Bank in particular, it's interesting. Israelis right now are focused far more on the judicial reform issues and on internal Israeli issues than they are on anything else. And one of the things that we've seen in these protests is an effort to really downplay the question of the West Bank, the question of the occupation, the question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that's probably smart tactically on the parts of the organizers of the demonstrations. But it doesn't take away the fact that there are real questions, certainly, about Israeli democracy with regard to the West Bank. And I would argue that that those are probably the most pressing questions with regard to Israeli democracy, particularly as we're talking about moves that will, from Israel's point of view, change the occupation from something that's temporary and military over disputed territory, in Israel's view, occupied territory in the view of much of the world, into something that is no longer a question.
Can I push you, Michael, on just one very quick point, and maybe a very quick answer, because as I want to try to get as many of these as I can in. Do you think that the coalition will soften its judicial overview plans, given the backlash you've seen in the streets, and I'm particularly also thinking about the business community? Will sort of the business community also want to push back? I'm just curious about what you're getting the sense is. Will that be enough to be a check? I mean, in 130,000 people in the streets of Tel Aviv, that's pretty serious. That reflects a much more serious movement.
Yeah. Way too early to tell. I think that the economic angle to this is probably the most powerful angle. But the fact that the prime minister wants to get rid of his trials, in some ways outweighs everything else. And the fact that it's actually not entirely in his control anymore. Remember, he's as you guys know, in Canada, it's in a parliamentary system. The prime minister is the prime minister, but he's not the president. And considering that the justice minister is probably the most radical figure in Israel on this issue and has been for years, and the fact that the head of the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee is not a member of Likud, he's a member of religious Zionism. In some ways, this is not entirely under Netanyahu's control.
That's a good way to actually say it. Now there's a real question I'm going to shift you to, because it goes back to our discussion from very long ago about the two-state solution. I mean, there's been virtual silence from the international community on some of these recent moves. There's been expressions of concern, but very little. But there doesn't seem to have been an international loud consensus about or an expression of concern. I'm just wondering, with Blinken's visit, there's a question here from one of our former ambassadors, how you view, the international response thus far, and is it helpful? Is a non-response helpful to the current situation, or would a more forceful response from Canada or from others be helpful in this regard?
Blinken is in Israel today and had a press conference with Netanyahu, and it was interesting. He raised the judicial reform issues repeatedly, talked about American expectations of shared values between the U.S. and Israel, and particularly shared democratic practices. He brought up explicitly things like rule of law and judiciary and checks and balances, and did it in kind of a friendly manner, but was very clear. Now, I think there's no question that the international community's response to this has the power to shape what happens. Netanyahu is very attuned to the international community. He's certainly attuned to the fact that he needs the international community for the continued growth of the Israeli economy, something that he takes credit for, first as finance minister in the early 2000s and then as prime minister for such a long time. He is attuned to the fact that politically, maybe his greatest strength is this notion that he's pressed for a long time, that he uniquely has relationships with world leaders and can walk into any world capital and immediately be treated as a peer, something that wasn't always a given for Israeli prime ministers. And so he's certainly attuned to the international community. I argued in print about a month ago, maybe less, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, that I thought it was a mistake for Blinken to be going to Israel now, because I think that Netanyahu and almost every Israeli politician, they get lots of political benefit from high-profile visits of foreign officials and invitations to foreign capitals. And with all these things on the table that are concerning to many world leaders and should be concerning to many world leaders, take a wait-and-see approach and see if Netanyahu delivers on people's concerns before giving him the political benefits of these types of high-profile visits. He's supposed to be he's headed to Paris this weekend, so we'll see how that plays out. But I do think that the international community here, in terms of just sort of statements and visits and how they interact with Netanyahu or any Israeli prime minister, they have influence and power.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's a lot of Israelis, and I think this current government will listen to Washington. I don't know how much Washington will move beyond some of these gestures or some of these words, and I think that's the question. And I mean, I think Netanyahu has also been kind of proud about how much he can get from Washington historically, and he's been pretty successful at sort of delivering. I think you're painting a really good picture of how Netanyahu has to balance things, from sort of the external, the international community, and his domestic constituents. So I guess I'm wondering is, how solid is this coalition? I mean, is he going to be able to give Smotrich and Ben Gvir enough to keep them on side? And we haven't even talked about Derry, and how his departure and the way he's departing, or maybe not departing, maybe he'll stay. So, I guess I'm just wondering how I answered the question, but I don't know, you can tell me what you think. It seems like this government has a bit more staying power than Netanyahu's previous coalitions. Tell me if you think I'm wrong. I mean, it is Israel after all, and it could fall at any time. But I'd be curious on your views on that. I mean, that's a selfish question, but I'll after you answer that very short question, we'll come back to some of the other thinking here and other questions.
The answer is that it depends on what happens and who you're talking about. So Ben-Gvir, for instance, Ben-Gvir is he can and will do a lot of damage, but he's effectively a media troll. Right. I think that he wants to remain minister, and he will probably be able to reconcile almost anything that does or does not happen with remaining as a minister. Aryeh Deri, who you just referenced, for those who aren't familiar, Aryeh Deri is the head of Shas, the Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox party. Until a week ago, he was interior minister and also health minister. But because he had left politics in the previous iteration of the Netanyahu government as part of a plea deal where he was brought up for tax charges, and he signed a plea deal promising to leave public life in return for just probation, and then he immediately re-entered public life and was appointed a minister. The Supreme Court said that he couldn't do that, which, by the way, is fueling the fire of this judicial reform idea. Right. And people expect that the Knesset is going to pass what's called the Deri bill to basically let him come back. Shas is going to stay in the government because they now have power over all sorts of subsidies, and I think Deri assumes that he'll be able to come back. Smotrich is different. Smotrich has a very clear ideological program he wants to implement with regard to the West Bank. Many of the things that we spoke about a few minutes ago. If he does not get them, I don't think he will stay in the government. He actually prevented Netanyahu from forming a government after the fourth election, because at that point, Netanyahu was negotiating with Mansour Abbas, the head of Ra'am, the Israeli Arab party that sat in the Bennett-Lapid government the first time, or coalition, I should say, the first time an independent Arab party sat in an Israeli coalition. Netanyahu had been negotiating with Abbas and Ra'am, and Smotrich said, I will not join a government, and my party will not join a government that includes an Arab party, and the numbers then didn't add up, and so Netanyahu wasn't able to form a government, and that's when Lapid got Bennett to join him, and you had the Bennett-Lapid government for a year and a half. Smotrich doesn't make empty threats, and so if he doesn't get what he wants out of this, I think he will leave, and he'll have no compunction about bringing the government down.
Yeah, I think you might be right about that. But will Netanyahu give him what he wants? And I think that's what we're all kind of waiting to see if that actually happens. But I mean, just going back to some of the there's a stream of consciousness in some of the questions that really raise more fundamental questions about Israel as a democracy, and I think the way you characterize it is quite good. It's not is or is not. It's sort of this continuum, and maybe things are a bit more challenged right now, and sort of that's a thing. But there's an sort of inexorable movement towards more settlements. We haven't talked about settler violence. I mean, we're sort of seeing a little bit more of that. It seems that the settler movement itself is more emboldened. And one of the questions here raises, well, this is, this again, it's at what point does the United States, or maybe let's be more specific, at what point does international jury say, sorry, this is not us, or is that already starting? I mean, are you monitoring diaspora thinking, or and to what extent does the Israeli government care about what the diaspora thinks? I mean, I'd be curious about that.
So there are a few different things going on. There has, for the past few years, been a movement on the left and among younger American Jews to take these concerns with regard to the occupation, Israel's treatment of Palestinians, and say this is not something that we can support. As Jews, we can't support a Jewish state that behaves in these ways. That is certainly something that is growing. It's still a bit limited, I think, in terms of numbers and scope, but that's a movement that's been growing. What we have seen since the election is now another element to this, which is concerns from diaspora Jews, and in many ways from some of the large organizations that represent North American Jews, over some of the things this coalition wants to do with regard to Jewish identity inside of Israel, which is a separate issue. And this goes to questions of the law of return, where right now, if you have one Jewish grandparent, you are eligible to immigrate and become a citizen of Israel. But there's a question from this coalition, given that 4 of the 5 parties are religious parties, whether that should be amended to bring it more in line with Jewish law, halacha, where you have to be Jewish through matrimonial descent. So if your mother is not Jewish, it wouldn't matter if you have one Jewish grandparent or even 3 Jewish grandparents. Right. So, there are questions about that. There are questions about recognition of conservative and reform Judaism inside of Israel. You have effectively, this is sort of a diaspora thing. In Israel, you don't really have these streams, but in diaspora, you effectively have Orthodox, conservative, and reform Judaism. In Israel, only Orthodox Judaism is recognized, and many of the rhythms of life inside of Israel, in terms of marriage, in terms of burial, in terms of conversion, are controlled by the Orthodox. So there's a question about whether this will mean even less recognition of conservative and reform Jews, who represent the overwhelming majority between conservative, reform, and sort of unaffiliated, represent the overwhelming majority of diaspora Jews. So you have this new kind of set of questions about these issues that go more toward these questions of Jewish identity and Jews' relationships with Israel than the questions of democracy that I think are motivating the first group. Not that the questions of democracy are irrelevant to the second group, but it's manifesting in a different way. And then, in general, when you have a government that is expanding settlements, talking about annexation, openly talking about passing laws that will cement Jewish primacy, if not Jewish supremacy, that is difficult for many diaspora Jews as well, given that diaspora Jews tend to be overwhelmingly liberal, tend to overwhelmingly vote for liberal parties and liberal policies, and their views of Israeli policies are ones that are more liberal. And so, there's this strain between Israel and diaspora Jews that is not new to this government, but I think we're seeing new elements of it become introduced as a result of some of the policies the government is pushing.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, I think as well I mean, we didn't talk about it very much, but I think the freer hand, I think that the settlers might feel with some of its figures becoming empowered is an interesting thing. I mean, I think there was one comment in the questions as though, none of these things are new for Palestinians. They are used to the occupation. They're sort of used to, restrictive measures and Israeli incursions, all those kind of things. None of this is new. Settlement expansion is not a new thing. And I do think some of the measures that have been proposed, legalizing these settlements, the illegal ones that Israel considers illegal, these things are new. So there is this because I'm just wondering, are we seeing the next generation of Israeli leadership at Smotrich and Gvir, other than the fact that he's a media, like you said, he's like a media personality and wants to hog the limelight. I'm just wondering, what comes after. I mean, if people like these ultranationalists are sort of regularized in Israeli society, for all the issue that matters to the international community, which is, human rights, democracy, the two-state solution, which again, I'm surprised we're still talking about. All of these things are going to matter. So, but what you're kind of telling us is actually, the debate going on inside Israel and between diaspora Jews and inside Judaism is the one that's going to be more of a determining factor. That's kind of what you're saying, isn't it?
I think in a lot of ways it is, unless something on the ground shifts, and I'll talk about that in a second. You use the term regularizing some of these nationalist figures, and that's a great characterization. Itamar Ben-Gvir was considered completely out of bounds by everybody, including Netanyahu, as recently as 3 years ago. And now here he is sitting as national security minister. And so, the Overton window on this is shifting, by the year, if not by the month. And there are, when you on top of that, the demographic trends in Israel point in a lot of ways to more right-wing and more radical politics and policies going forward. The birth rate among the ultra-Orthodox, not surprisingly, far outpaces any other demographic, either Jewish or non-Jewish, inside of Israel and the West Bank. I've seen projections by 2040 the ultra-Orthodox population will be 25% of the country. The national religious population, many of whom, not all of whom, but many of whom are settlers, also growing, and you increasingly see them in more prominent positions within politics, within the IDF, and they tend to be more right-wing and more hawkish. So all of that certainly points to, and I should also note that Israel is distinctive among many countries. The trend in most countries in the West is that the older you are, the more conservative you are, and the younger you are, the more liberal you are. In Israel, it's actually the opposite. The older you are, the more liberal you are. The younger you are, the more conservative you are. And Israel has a young population that is growing younger by the year. And so all of these point to more rightward trends in Israeli politics. Now, I think if we look at something that might disrupt this situation, it may be that the policies of this government kind of bring the whole house of cards down when it comes to the West Bank. In years of talking to Palestinians, both PA officials and Palestinian civil society activists and kind of ordinary Palestinians in the street, it's always striking that not the PA folks as much, but the others, uniformly talk about Oslo as being a terrible development that effectively created this Palestinian subcontractor for the occupation. And the Israeli security establishment and the right wing in many ways have internalized that. This idea that the PA takes care of many things in the West Bank that Israel doesn't have to. It's a benefit for all the bashing of Oslo on the Israeli right. In many ways, it's the Israeli right that benefits from it the most by not having to own the full consequences of many of its policies, because the PA is administering the 2.5 million Palestinians living in areas A and B, and doesn't require the IDF to be everywhere all at once. Many of the things that the Israeli government is starting to do I'm always wary about being the boy who cries wolf, but many of them have the capacity to, I think, bring the PA down. The PA is overwhelmingly unpopular among Palestinians, and when you add on to that increasing settlements and move towards applying sovereignty, and the fact that we've seen even more Israeli financial sanctions on the PA since this government has taken control. If that all comes down and Israel has to go back into areas A and B in full force and literally be administering Jenin and Nablus and Ramallah, that's the kind of thing that may bring some of these Israeli right-wing policies to a halt if they actually have to contemplate the kind of terminal endpoint of what this looks like.
That's a great point, and this is where maybe I'll step in on the Palestinians. So, I tend to think that the PA itself is it's an administrative, almost municipal body that that is fundamentally challenged because of the way it's perceived and because it works. It's seen as sort of the subcontractor of the occupation. But I think an inflection point is coming up, and that's Abbas's death. I don't know if I'm convinced anymore that the PA itself will collapse. It's in bad shape now, and it's still somehow hanging on. So, I don't know if it's the correct way for us to conceptualize the PA. It may not necessarily collapse in the way we understand it or in the way we say it. And in many respects, it's already collapsed in the minds of Palestinians. But the reality is, I think an inflection point might be coming, particularly if there's a power struggle for whatever's left over, and particularly if there's violence between different Palestinian elements. I think Israel will want to step in more forcefully, and we'll have to take over some of those administrative functions. And I found that very curious because a lot of activists have called for that. They've said, well, the PA it's not in our interest, and maybe it is better for the Israel to step in and maybe assume some of the consequences for its occupation, right? But one of the questions here, I can let you comment on that, but one of the questions we do have in our chat group is, well, what does it mean for normalization with all of these states? Netanyahu still has this goal of, well, I'm going to normalize with Saudi Arabia. That's his one thing that he hasn't been able to do. I guess, for me, I can tell you my views, but I just don't know what it actually means. I don't see the UAE stepping back. I don't see Morocco or other countries who've normalized with Israel stepping back at this point, because they seem to be all in. And so what would it take? Another Gaza conflict. I mean, I think that I'll turn it over to you, but I'm not sure normalization is in question at this point.
I agree with you. I'm actually not sure that there's anything that I can envision that would make the UAE and Bahrain step back. Morocco, a bit different, especially since we've seen this before with Morocco, right, where they established normalized relations with Israel in the 90s and then suspended them in 2001 with the Second Intifada and then kept them frozen until 2020. UAE and Bahrain are different stories. I mean, trade between Israel and the UAE is now pushing $2 billion. The security relationship between Israel and Bahrain is way too important to the Bahrainis. So I don't think there's actually really anything conceivable that could happen in the West Bank that would reverse normalization. And I'm sure that Netanyahu knows that as well. Now, I do think that it can certainly be damaged or sort of downgraded, and I think that the thing that's most likely to lead to that would be friction on the Temple Mount. Right. I think Netanyahu understands that too. But if there is a real clash over the Temple Mount, either because of a change in Israeli policy or because we've obviously seen violence on the Temple Mount before, that's the sort of thing that makes it a lot more difficult, even for the UAE, to just continue with business as usual. So, I can see a situation where the Emirati ambassador would be recalled for consultations, but I don't think that normalization is not getting rolled back. Now, with regard to the Saudis, there it's interesting. There's all this messaging coming from MBS and even just a couple weeks ago in Davos from the Saudi foreign minister, intimating that normalization can go forward really with nothing happening on the Palestinian front. I may be proven wrong on this, but I think that's more posturing than it is anything else. Not necessarily because the Saudis deeply care about what happens to the Palestinians, but I think because their politics are different. It seems pretty clear to me that what Saudi wants to normalize with Israel are a number of steps from the United States. It has almost nothing to do with Israel. But even if the United States were to turn around tomorrow and say to the Saudis, hey, we'll give you a security guarantee akin to NATO Article 5, and we will pass some sort of bill that makes it impossible for Congress to limit arms sales, and we'll come to some sort of a stable agreement on oil sales and weapons. I don't think that MBS could tomorrow just snap its fingers and normalize. You do have a large religious establishment within Saudi Arabia and a conservative establishment within Saudi Arabia that I think would need some gestures toward the Palestinians. I do think at this point, Saudi normalization is probably a matter of when rather than if. But I don't think it's happening right around the corner. And I do think there are more difficult politics to contend with. And I think that it's in MBS's interest to tell the U.S. that it just requires some moves from the U.S. so that he, gets what he wants. But I do think that he will need something. It'll be short of a Palestinian state, but I think he will need some sort of gestures from the Israelis on the West Bank with regard to the Palestinians before he could really move forward on something like that.
Yeah, I think we're so far away from that, particularly with this government. So I'm not sure that's on offer or on the table.
And on that point, I'll note that Smotrich, if you were to say to him, you can normalize with Saudi tomorrow if you stop what you're doing on the West Bank, he would not take that deal. So I think Netanyahu's coalition partners are different this time than they were last time.
Yeah, I know. I think that makes perfect sense, and that's what I would have expected. And so that's what I think going on. But I mean, going forward, given the events of the weekend, I mean, we had Isfahan being attacked and reportedly other sites in Iran being attacked. Netanyahu is a master of externalizing sort of the threat, focusing on the far enemy, Iran. But this government has been remarkably inward focused, which I find is an extremely, so I'm just wondering, does Netanyahu, grand strategy, thinking broader, seek to take this opportunity to externalize, to sort of say, we got to shift our focus to Iran? Would that be part of his playbook, or is he not there yet?
I mean, Netanyahu's always had his eye on Iran, right? It's been like this for him for 40 years. But I also think it's important to note he's certainly not alone in this. There really is a lot of continuity between Netanyahu and Bennett Lapid before him, and certainly the various Mossad directors. Right now it's David Barnea, before him it was Yossi Cohen, on Iran. We've had kind of irrespective of what's going on in Israeli politics, there now for years have been basically uninterrupted Israeli strikes on Iranian weapon shipments transiting across Syria, on IRGC positions in Syria. We've now seen, assassinations inside Iran. We did see this suicide drone strike on, what's supposed to be a supersonic missile R&D facility in Iran over the weekend. So this has been going on, now for years. So I think it wouldn't matter who the prime minister is. I think that this is something that all Israeli politicians and all the upper echelons of the IDF and Mossad take seriously. And, Netanyahu certainly made this his pet issue, particularly surrounding the JCPOA in a public way. But I think that there's a lot of continuity with regard to this across Israeli politics.
So you said something really interesting there. So to tack, and again, it tracks very closely with some of the comments and questions we're getting, is, it really doesn't matter who the Israeli prime minister is. Let's say not just towards Iran, but towards Palestinians as well. I think the common wisdom is that, well, it does matter actually, and I think you and I can agree. Yes, maybe the pace of settlement constructions, the legalization of outposts, there is sort of a difference with this government. There's a question on is there, what is a one-state solution? I mean, are Israelis even thinking about that? My answer to that would be we are kind of already in a one-state reality in many respects. It's just that the one-state reality is not what the international community or Palestinians would envisage. So I think you would agree with that, but I just want to put it to you because, one of the questions is, would Israelis support a one-state solution? I guess it really depends what the one-state solution is. I mean, the one-state solution as it currently exists, I think Israelis would go for it.
Yeah. So the few elements I want to answer this. So first on the question of, does it matter who the Israeli prime minister is? I think it depends. If we look at things like settlement construction, the answer is no. Not only do all Israeli prime ministers build in the West Bank, in many cases, the ones whom you'd expect to build slower, such as Ehud Barak or Bennett Lapid, actually build faster. With regard to kind of the day-to-day of Palestinian lives, there I think it does matter. For instance, under the Bennett Lapid government, we did see a number of restrictions loosened in the West Bank. Not only more construction for Palestinians in Area C, not like an explosion, but more, but also, a genuine increase in work permits, a genuine increase in some of the economic restrictions that were lifted. We did see better hours at Allenby Bridge. We finally saw 3G. I mean, again, it's kind of a joke given that we're now in a 5G world, but the point is there certainly were things that improved depending on the prime ministers. But then I think the biggest aspect is in terms of political horizon, right? Ehud Barak may have been building very fast, but he was serious about negotiating with the Palestinians and trying to figure out some sort of endpoint. Ehud Olmert, even though there was no way he was going to see it through given his own corruption problems and his own indictments, was serious about negotiating with Abbas and trying to come to some sort of agreement. And so, I think that while that may not impact the day-to-day lives of Palestinians, it does matter in terms of the larger picture and trying to get to a much better situation. So, I do think on that front, it absolutely matters. On the question of one state, I agree with you. I think that there's no question that right now Israel is dealing with a one-state reality, and there's also no question to me that when people, mostly on the left, talk about one state, a single democratic state, or a binational state, that is not something that Israelis will ever support. It's not anything that any Israeli government would ever allow. Zionism was built on this notion of Jewish political liberation and Jewish sovereignty in the Jewish homeland and a Jewish state. And so I think that the more people push for one state, the more dismayed they're going to be, because that one state is going to look like a Jewish but not democratic state. Israeli Jews, in every single poll, when you ask them what is more important, they say Jewish state versus democratic state. And so I think pushing for a formalized one state situation will end very, very badly for what Palestinians and their supporters want to see in terms of real Palestinian liberation and democracy. It's why we can fight all day about whether two states is still viable or not, but from my perspective, it's why it's worth trying to push for it until sort of the very last moment, because if you want to see a fair and just solution to this, it's not going to come through one state.
I'm surprised you don't think we're already there, but it's one of the things I keep pushing you on. But what I enjoy our discussions. I wonder if we're already there. I mean, really, because if we're not already there, I'll ask you the question I asked you last time, and I want a very quick answer because I have one last question for you. What will it take for you to say it is the two-state solution? That's it. It's over. And it's really not something that we should be discussing at the policy level. What would it take for you?
Formal annexation of Area C.
Formal
annexation of Area C. Right. Because once you annex Area C, it's very difficult in the Israeli political context to see that being reversed. Right. And at that point, it's not just you're talking about 60% of the West Bank, in terms of the territory. Yeah. It's as people may know from a map, it's literally a spider web. Once you do that, you're in a permanent one-state reality.
Exactly, and from my understanding is once that happens, it's very hard legislatively to get that shifted in Israel. Is that right?
Yes, because the Knesset passed a law saying that to cede territory, you have to have 80 members of Knesset vote to cede it. Actually, it's one of the things that the now the new government, but at the time was the opposition, challenged Yair Lapid on in terms of the maritime deal with Lebanon. Because they claimed that was ceding Israeli territory, and so they claimed it was illegal without 80 members of Knesset voting for it. That challenge got rejected, but yes.
Okay, well, very interesting. It's we'll see if that happens in this government, but I'm not sure. I think we made the case that they don't necessarily need to do that. But look, given the current reality, and maybe I'll end off here, and I will note that I have to sign off in like 9 minutes because my support center is telling me they're going to sign me out involuntarily. Talk about occupation, but this is what it feels like from a digital occupation. But I did want to ask you before we ended our conversation is, where you see a role for the international community. It's kind of an unfair question, but Canada's we like to see ourselves as this middle player. On this question, a lot of people have accused Canada of being sort of absent and maybe not there, and our voting pattern has been off the mark, and historically very 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 opposed to how we used to vote. One could say, are we really being a friend to Israel? I mean, what would we have to sort of, what would you want from Canada, or what Canada can do, like a middle power that Israel does respect? I think there is a strong respect for Canada from Israel. What role can we play in given the current polarized context, or is saying nothing a better role? Like I genuinely wonder what is a better option. But I wanted to pose that question to you because I know it's within the minds of a lot of our listeners.
So I would never say that saying nothing is the best option or a better option. Okay. I think that something I said before about the power of politics. All Israeli politicians rely on international prestige, and so foreign visits and foreign invitations really are a useful tool that nobody seems to want to wield when it comes to Israeli leaders, but I think that's one lever. And then, the other lever is international institutions. And this is a tricky one because Israelis, and I think rightly, view international institutions in many ways as being biased against them. When you look at kind of things like Israel being the only permanent agenda item on the UN Human Rights Council, it's hard to argue that Israelis aren't being disproportionately singled out. I think that there is a way to use international institutions to weigh in with Israel, but it has to be in a targeted and fair way. So kind of huge broad-based attacks on Israeli policy that put them out of context, that's never gonna work, never convince Israelis. Right. I do think that if Israel is to go ahead, for instance, and retroactively legalize outposts, and there is a targeted resolution on the issue of outposts, that's the kind of thing that is not inherently unfair and that will get Israelis' attention. But I think that, unfortunately, within international institutions, oftentimes it turns into a much wider attack on Israel or on Zionism or on Israel's right to exist. And that understandably raises Israeli hackles and frankly makes it harder to kind of use this as an effective vehicle to change Israeli behavior. So I'd say those two things are, are things that I think any government should kind of be thinking about and, and using in terms of its engagement with Israel.
I think that's a great, you know what, I can't tell you how, that's a great, particularly the latter suggestion, maybe a more targeted approach could be something that's be more useful for us to think about in, middle power like Canada. Maybe that is something that we need to consider more seriously. One issue we didn't touch on, we have a few seconds left. I did want to ask you about the war in Ukraine. It's a question that came up in our chat, but also everyone assumed that Netanyahu's return would mean some backtracking from Israel on the Ukraine issue. And Netanyahu's good relationship with Putin, and people thought, well, he's going to recalibrate and sort of repair ties with Putin, but it hasn't happened as quickly as I would have thought. And Putin is still using the Jewish agency, kicking out the U.S. Jewish agency in Russia as part of his lever to exert pressure on Israel to end support to Ukraine or whatever the support they are providing, which is largely defensive, by the way. So I'd be curious in your views on that, if we in the few minutes we have left.
Yeah, it was announced today that Eli Cohen, the new foreign minister, is actually going to be traveling to Kiev, which
right.
Listen, I think Netanyahu is going to tread carefully, given Russia's presence in Syria, which has really been the motivating factor from the beginning behind Israel's policy, wanting to preserve its freedom of action in the skies over Syria to hit Iranian targets. And you raise the issue of the Jewish agency. There's always a question about the safety of Russian Jews. But I also think that since Netanyahu has been in the prime minister's seat the last time, things have shifted, right? We're now starting to see Western countries provide tanks to Ukraine. We're seeing that Russia did not roll over Ukraine militarily, as many people, including me, assumed would happen. And so I think that the politics of it are a bit different. I think that kind of Israel's sort of managing geopolitically within the international community, it's a lot tougher now to not lean towards Ukraine. I think Netanyahu is certainly sensitive to all these issues. I don't think he's ever going to go so far as to really step out on this issue. We also saw last week Israel refused or turned down, I should say, an American request to send Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, which is a much older system that's literally sitting in Israeli warehouses, to Ukraine because they don't want to be perceived as sending weapons to Ukraine. So I think he's going to tread cautiously and kind of proceed on this slowly. But the position he took last time, which was not pro-Putin, but kind of trying to straddle the fence, I think, in a real way, I'm not sure that's as tenable politically now as it was a year and a half ago.
Are you more worried now about, just to end off, are you more worried now about Israel's democracy than you've been before? I mean,
yes, without question.
I think that's an excellent place to wrap it up, because I we are concerned, and then I think it's a place we haven't been before, and you've certainly helped us, and helped me sort of clarify, where we might be going, and it's going to be very interesting to watch. All that to say, on behalf of the Middle East Discussion Group and the Canada International Council, I wanted to thank you for joining us, and it was great to see you again personally. So I have you're welcome here anytime, and certainly come back to Ottawa and visit us. We do appreciate you joining us, and thank you everyone for joining. And we will be seeing you very soon at our next Middle East Discussion Group. Thank you again, Michael. We'll talk to you soon.
My pleasure, and thanks everyone who joined.
Thank you.